The following webinar was recorded live on May 4th, 2020 on the subject of memory and learning. How we can leverage learning in order to maximize what we are doing with in school, and whether it's online learning, whether it's at home. And so I'm just going to kind of move through this webinar. There might be an opportunity for question and answer at the end, so go ahead and keep those questions active. And once again, if you cannot hear, one thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to click the phone icon that's on your screen, and that is going to give you access to the audio preferences. And then what that's going to do is that is going to select your audio choice, and then you're going to select the mic and speak. That is going to help us figure out what we need to be doing. And before we get going, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Aaron Daffern. I live in Fort Worth, Texas. I work at a large urban district in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. I'm an author, and I am an education consultant, and I do all kinds of things. But I've learned a lot about memory and learning that I think is going to really, really help us this evening. Because we all want to work smarter and not harder. We want to make sure that our students remember what we're doing. So as you are getting ready, this is going to be about as interactive of a webinar as we can make it, because it is a webinar, so it is mainly going to be one way. So one thing you can do would be to have a pencil and a piece of paper ready. There are going to be a few times where I'm going to ask you to jot some notes, just to write some things down. So make sure you have the pencil and the piece of paper ready. And we are going to go ahead and move on. So let's talk about some common problems that we have with learning. One of the things that I've noticed, and this is my 20th year in education, is students have a hard time recalling previously taught information. You'll go over it in class, they'll pass an assessment, and then for some reason a week later they'll look at you like you are the craziest person in the world, like you've never looked at that before. And so sometimes students really have a hard time keeping track of what we did and how it connects with everything. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that they can recall previously taught information. And they also have difficulty applying facts and skills to new contexts. You teach them a skill in one isolated context, you switch the words a little bit, you change the dynamics. In math, this is a huge problem. They can do the skill in isolation, you put it in a word problem, and they've got no idea what you're talking about. And so then you really wonder, well, did they ever really learn it if they can't apply it in a new and unique situation? They have difficulty connecting new information with prior knowledge, and sometimes we have students that they don't know that anything connects, so they have all of these isolated bits of information, but they don't connect together. Another problem is they have sometimes they have difficulty selecting the right skill to solve a problem. We have to prompt them too much, or we have to include keywords in order for them to know, do I need to analyze? Do I need to synthesize? Do I need to use a particular mathematical operation? Students have difficulty knowing what to do when, unless they're led very strongly. And then this is the biggest problem. If any of you have ever taught math, you know you've probably taught some type of four-step math problem-solving process. Understand, problem, solve the problem, and then check it. And my favorite thing is when students will just put a big check at the end. They think that checking the problem literally means putting a check at the end, because they don't know how to estimate or how to check their response for reasonableness. So that's a big problem. The old saying goes, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it still make a noise? Well, I would say in education, if a student learns something but can't remember it a week later, can we really say it was ever truly learned? Well, that's what I'm hoping that we're going to get to at the bottom of this hour-long webinar. Make sure you have a pencil and a piece of paper handy. We're going to have a quick memory test just to set the stage. And I see Della in the chat, you are correct. I did come out to New Horizons out at Gulfway. That was a great day with us. And so you're going to need a pencil and a piece of paper in just a moment. We're going to take a quick memory test. I want to set the stage for you. So what's going to happen is I'm going to read 8 statements aloud. I'm going to read them slowly, and I'm only going to read them one time each. You are not going to write them down yet. We will need the pencil and paper in just a moment. Your task is simply to remember the descriptor for each man and then what he did. So here's an example. I might say, the twitchy man went into the house. Then when we go over the answers, I would ask, what did the twitchy man do? And your job would be to say, he went into the house. You're supposed to remember what kind of man he was. In this example, he was a twitchy man. And then what did he do? He went into the house. At this point, this is just memory. I do not want you to write anything down. You are simply going to use your wonderful brains. I'm going to read each sentence once. There will be 8 statements. Each one will have a different man and a different thing or action that this man did. Are we ready? Here we go. We're not writing this down. We're just remembering. Number 1. The bearded man threw away the coupon. Number 2. The curious man forgot the key. Number 3. The tall man laughed at the dog. Number 4. The strong man took off his cap. Number 5. The Italian man sat on the bench. Number 6. The sweaty man stared at the pond. Number 7. The sweet man ran up the stairs. And then finally, number 8. The military man left his house. All right, that wasn't too difficult, was it? Let's see how you did. This is where you need your pencil and paper. Go ahead and number those 1 through 8. I'm going to read you the 8 men. I'm going to change the order, and I'm just going to ask you, what did this man do? What did this man do? And then you're just going to write down as best you can, and we'll go over the answers in just a moment. This is all setting up how our brains work and how we can make it more memorable. So I'm going to reread the stems. They're going to be in random order. Just write down, you got a piece of paper, hopefully, 1 through 8. All right. The Italian man, what did he do? Go ahead and write that down. Number 2, what did the bearded man do? Number 3, what did the sweaty man do? Doesn't have to be perfect, a general gist of what each man did. Number 4, what did the tall man do? Number 5, what did the military man do? Number 6, what did the strong man do? Give you a moment to catch up. Number 7, what did the sweet man do? And then finally, number 8, the curious man, what did he do? Now, if you did pretty poorly, that is perfectly fine. This was not meant to put you in an area of strength. This was a very difficult test, and we're going to explain why in just a moment. We're going to go over the answers real quick. If you got it, just put a check. If not, just put an X, Scout's honor, and then we'll take a moment. If you want to type in the chat after we reveal the answers, you can let us know how many you got correct. So real quick, number 1, the Italian man sat on the bench. If you got the general gist, that's fine. Doesn't need to be word for word. The bearded man, number 2, threw away the coupon. 3, the sweaty man stared at the pond. Number 4, the tall man laughed at the dog. Number 5, the military man left his house. Number 6, the strong man took off his cap. Number 7, the sweet man ran up the stairs. And then finally, number 8, the curious man forgot the key. If you feel brave enough, go ahead and just type into the chat box, if you can find it, how many did you get correct? And the reason why we're spending so much time doing this is because I want to show you what happens to our students a lot of times. So Della, 6 out of 8. Pam, 5. Susan, 2. Stephanie, 7. Karen, you got 6. That's excellent. Good for y'all. Some of you did really well. Some of you struggled. Here's the thing. When we're teaching, it all makes sense to us. Everything makes sense because we are content experts. We've taught this lesson 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. But sometimes all the kids are hearing are the Italian man sat on the bench or the bearded man threw away the coupon. The harder we try to keep these in our brain, the quicker they slip out. It's like trying to grip dry sand. It's very difficult. Alyssa, 3 out of 8. We'll get you there, Alyssa. 6 out of 8. Jessica, good. Bobby, 3 out of 8. We'll get all of you up a little bit higher. What I wanted to show you is that even simple things like this, it's very difficult for our brain to latch onto these because they were all out of context. So now we're going to explain why it didn't work and what we can do, because we'll take a new test in just a moment at the end of our webinar here. But here's a very simple memory model. If you just Google memory models, you'll see there's a lot of different ones out there. But if you just look on the screen real quick, there's 3 basic things happening, right? Starting on the left, you get information comes through our various senses. So that's that very first arrow on the left, right? Our 5 senses. And then assuming we pay attention to it, it gets into our sensory memory, right? So that sensory memory, we pay attention to something, and then it gets into our short-term working memory, right? And then when students pay attention to those things, they keep them in short-term memory, but it's limited. There's only so much that they could pay attention to. So most of you, if I just gave you a 2 or 3 question test about the bearded man and the Italian man and the sweaty man, you probably could have juggled those things. But by the time I got to the 6th and the 7th and the 8th, you had lost the 1st and the 2nd because it was all completely out of context. And then what you see, those 2 arrows on the right is what we're going to be dealing with this evening, the encoding and the retrieval. So when it becomes encoded, it goes into long-term memory. And that's what's happening over there on the far right. Is you see that long-term memory, and typically that happens through overnight. That's why sleep is so important, and it goes through a process that's called consolidation. And then it's in our long-term memory, and then if we want to bring it back, we have to go through a process called retrieval. So we recall it back, we tell the kids, hey, you remember what we learned last week? We were talking about life cycles. Well, now we're going to do the life cycle of a plant, and we're hoping that they can retrieve that information from the long-term memory, bring it into their short-term memory so they can do something with it. But do you notice those arrows that are happening at the bottom of every single one of those boxes? They're forgetting, and they're forgetting. Forgetting happens continually. It is a natural process. One of our main tasks with learning is how we can interrupt forgetting, because they're going to forget from the sensory memory. They're going to forget if it's short-term memory, and then long-term memory, if we don't do anything with it, they're going to forget. That's how our memory works, because there's only so much that we can remember. So our job here is to try to leverage 2 points in memory. First is we're going to be talking about encoding and retrieval. Encoding is how we make the learning stickier. We're going to get to that second. We're actually going to talk about retrieval first. This is how we get the information out of our long-term memory. Now, before we get there, I want to pause. I want to give you about 2 minutes because we've kind of gone quite a ways, and you may or may not have had a chance to really think about that memory model that we put back up there. So if you can, take that same piece of paper. I'll just give us 2 minutes to kind of think about what we learned about memory, about the encoding, the processing, the forgetting, and the retrieval. And let's just make a word pyramid real quick. This is a real quick just processing task that you can do. So we're going to build something about memory. So here's an example of a word pyramid. You start with a letter. In this case, this is an example of if I was a history teacher and I was doing something about the Civil War. I would start with a common letter. So your most common letters are S, P, C, D, or M. Start with one of those. And just start with a 2-letter word or a 3-letter word and just start generating some words that would go with memory. In this case, this example is for Civil War. And I'll just give us 2 minutes, and I just want us to kind of process what we learned about memory before we keep moving on. So let me just kind of put this timer up real quick. And just be thinking, what do you know about memory? How does this latch on to stuff that you've already learned about memory, or is it all completely new? And then just go ahead and just jot down a few. And if you want to use the word pyramid, you can. If you can't come up with a 2-letter word, those are kind of hard. You might need to start with a 3-letter word. And if you have time, you can add a sentence kind of using that word. But that's how a word pyramid works. All right, so hopefully we had just a chance to think about and process a little bit through something some of you might be familiar with called chunk and chew. You get a little information, and then we have to kind of stop and think about it for a moment. So we've learned a little bit about memory. Before we really get into the first part, which is retrieval, I want to do a real quick prediction. I'm just going to give you 3 statements, and you can just write down true or false. Number 1, the best way to review previously learned information is to reread the notes or the portion of the text. And think about your own days as a student in college, master's degree, bachelor's degree. You needed to cram for a test. Is the best way to do it rereading the notes or the portion of the text? True or false? 2, when reviewing information, it's better to mix up the content rather than only reviewing one skill that should read one skill at a time. So should you block it all together, or should you mix things up? True or false? And number 2 says it's better to mix it up rather than blocking it all together. And then finally, number 3. As long as students attempt to retrieve the learned information, they don't necessarily need to get feedback on the accuracy of the retrieval. Just actually trying to remember is good enough. So these are our statements. Just predict real quick whether you think those are true or false, and then we will learn a little bit about retrieval because that's the first thing that we're dealing with here. So first, we're dealing with retrieval. How do we get the information out of the long-term memory? I would highly suggest going to this particular website you see on the bottom, powerfulteaching.org. Both of these books were actually written from the same study. Some researchers did quite a bit of study both in labs, in colleges, and in actual K-12 schools to figure out how can we increase learning, and they just focused on the retrieval. They were just focusing on this retrieval part. They weren't necessarily worried too much about encoding. And two different books came out of the same study, and there are 4 things that we know from tons of research in all kinds of different settings help kids remember things. And they both come out of these 2 books. I linked this one at the bottom, powerfulteaching.org, and this slide deck will be on my website as well if you wanted to link it. And both of these images are also linked to their books on Amazon. Powerfulteaching.org, the authors, Dr. Agarwal and Dr. Bain, have some pretty cool resources that are free. They'll also sell you the book, but they've got some neat resources in there. There are 4 things to remember when we're trying to get kids to remember what we've learned. Number 1 is, the biggest one is retrieval practice. It is way more effective to retrieve, to bring the information back to mind than rereading the notes or rereading a portion of the text. Because cramming works for short term. If cramming didn't work, college students wouldn't do it. But it is horrible for long-term retention. And I'm sure if you think about your own college days, you cram, you did a data dump, you took the test, boom, it's gone. We really don't want our students doing that. We want them to retain our information for long-term. So it's much better to do retrieval practice. And we have a few examples up here in this text. It can be as simple as writing down everything you remember. Literally 5 minutes before the end of class, you say, all right, guys, let's stop. Pull out your notebooks, write down everything you remember from the math lesson today. Just writing down what they remembered is a form of retrieval practice. It can be regular mini quizzes, not full-on, full-scale, let's stop teaching for 45-minute quizzes, but little 3-question quizzes. Maybe you put some questions in a fishbowl and you pull them out at the end. At the end of class, and you just ask students questions, then that's retrieval practice. Or you stop during a lecture and you have the students to jot down 2 notes. What they actually teach in their books, and I've read both of these books, is, and this really isn't necessarily as prevalent in the lower grades, because typically we don't ask kids to take notes in elementary school, but if you're a secondary school teacher, it's actually better for them not to take notes when you're in the middle of a lecture or you're in the middle of some kind of demonstration. Have them close the notebook, listen to you, watch what you're saying, and then stop the lecture, say, you have 2 minutes. Write down what you remember, and then you open it up and you keep going. That is going to be much more powerful than actually taking notes during the lecture, because while you're taking notes, you're not really paying attention. You're trying to write something down. So that's the first part. Spacing is very powerful. You increase the power of retrieval if you spread things out. You do a little bit today, a little bit in 2 days, and a little bit next week. Don't jam it all together. But when you're trying to retrieve past information, you bring it up, you wait for a little bit of forgetting, and then you bring it back up maybe a few days later. The third part is interleaving. And so interleaving is mixing things up. And if you've ever taught math, you know what happens when you get kids and you give them a set of 10 problems, let's say they're word problems, and every single word problem the answer is going to be solved by multiplying the numbers. After the kids figure out the pattern of 2 or 3 questions, their brain goes on autopilot. They're not reading the problem. They're just taking the numbers and multiplying. And then suddenly you throw a division problem in the middle of it, and they just go crazy. They all get it wrong, or they freak out, right? Because their brain is on autopilot. It is harder, and it's going to make them go a little bit slower, but it's much more powerful if you mix things up. If you do a little bit, if you're a science teacher, of maybe do some physical science and then some life science, and you mix it all up, and you don't just keep everything in its own separate silo. You mix things up. That's called interleaving. And then finally, you've got to give them that metacognitive feedback. So you give them a little quiz, you give them a little turn and talk to your partner about what we talked about yesterday, but then they have to get feedback. Were they right? Were they partially right? Were they completely wrong? They have to know whether they were right or wrong and how close they were. That's going to help them. So going back to our prediction guide, let's see what we have here. So number 1 was false. The best way to review is not to reread notes. It's actually to do retrieval practice rather than going back and rereading. They actually talk a little bit about that in those books. you get what's called the curse of knowledge. You feel like you are understanding it because you're remembering what you're rereading, but they actually did tons of tests. They had some kids reread their notes, some kids do some retrieval practice where they're trying to answer questions, and the kids that did the retrieval practice did much better on the quizzes and the tests. Number 2 was true. It is much better to mix things up than to just isolate skills. And then number 3, it is definitely not true. They need to get their metacognitive feedback to know whether their retrieval was completely correct, partially correct, or just way off base. So that is retrieval. And if you just did that, if you left the webinar right now and all you did was some retrieval practice, you inserted a little bit of some quiz questions 5 minutes before the end of class, you open up the beginning of class every day and you say, guys, our journal topic for today is what did you learn yesterday in the lesson? And that's all they did was try to remember what they learned yesterday. That effort, which is going to kill some of them because that's going to be hard to remember, it's that effort, that desirable difficulty is what they call in the books. That's what's going to help bring it back up. So we talked about retrieval. Let's get to our other leverage point, and that's encoding. Encoding is the chunking and chilling. It's how we can make our learning stickier. So once we get the information into our long-term memory, retrieval helps us get it back out. But how can we make sure that the information going into long-term memory actually gets in there? Because if I asked you about what the bearded man did and what the Italian man did and what the sweaty man did, you probably have already forgotten unless you wrote those things down, because those just went in and out. How can we make what we're teaching much more stickier so that it has a much better chance of being encoded into the long-term memory? So basically, we have to elaborate. What we got from these books is kids have to do something. And you're probably familiar with this. You might not necessarily have the terms, but you know that kids have to actively learn. They have to actively engage in the learning. If they're just passively sitting and getting, it's a waste of time. They have to make meaning. They have to wrestle with it. They have to tweak it. And so what I did is I took this term elaboration and generation, and I wanted to make it an acrostic just so it's a little bit easier to remember. So these are 9 different things. We'll look at them real quick that you can do, and you can take any task that you have planned, and you can easily do it if you're doing your at-home learning while you're in the COVID-19 lockdown, or you could do it in the fall when we get back into our classrooms. You can take any single task you have, and before you assign it to the kids, you can look at it and you say, how am I asking the kids to elaborate? And the more of these you can hit, the stickier the learning is going to be, so that it's going to have a much better chance of getting encoded into the long-term memory. So let's just extend what each of these different actions are. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some pretty good thinking skills and strategies that we can ask our students to do. So elaboration is the process of finding additional layers of meaning. Here's the thing, our brains are pattern detectors. We are always trying to figure out how does something work. Classification is such an important skill, and that's one of these skills. Once we can tie what I'm about to teach you into something you already know, or once I can show you the form, or once I can show you the big picture, here's the structure and this is where it fits in, then it all makes sense. But if all I'm doing is saying the bearded man threw away the coupon and the Italian man sat on the bench and the sweaty man, I can't remember what he did, that's all they're hearing. And it's just random bits of information that we're constantly spewing at them. They have to make connections. They have to elaborate, find additional layers of meaning. It has to make sense for them. And this is how they can do it. So one thing they can do is they can explain. So teach something to a kid, and they're looking at you, and they're tracking, and they're nodding their heads, and then you stop and say, all right, quick, turn and talk to your partner, explain to them how to do what I just told you what to do. And that's hard. And you'll see kids they'll kind of turn their head, and they'll kind of look up to the side, and maybe they'll get it, maybe they won't get it. But that act of trying to explain something to somebody else, or maybe even just writing an explanation. Obviously, if you can get them to talk to each other, that's great. Oral language development is very important, but it can even be a quick written response. Tell me how to do what I just told you what to do. Let them put it in their own words. Looking is just observing and describing and looking at it from multiple perspectives. But when you put anything in front of kids, if it's a new manipulative, if it's a new toy, if it's anything, especially if you're like a science teacher and you're about to get a new piece of lab equipment, right? You got to let them look at it and touch it first. That's the first thing they're going to want to do, is touch it and play with it. And what they're doing is they're trying to encode it. They're trying to figure out, what is this thing? So they're looking at it, they're observing it, they're touching it, they're smelling it, they're feeling it, they're doing all of that. And so when we ask them to look and observe, that is encoding. Association. Most of us know that if we can associate a new knowledge with prior knowledge, once we find that connection, then that is going to help us. There was one, for example, there was one lady that I was working with at one of the schools that I work at, and I must have asked her last name. Her name was Mrs. Merritt, and I couldn't remember Merritt. I saw her once a week, and I must have asked her 5 times, and I just couldn't remember her name. I knew it started with an M, but I couldn't remember what it was. And then finally I made the association. I was like, okay, so there's a town in my street, and it's Merritt Street, and I would drive down that street to take my kids to school. And then I never forgot her name again because I made the association. And kids do that. If they can associate new knowledge, even if it's a random association, but if they can associate new knowledge with prior knowledge, that's the hook. We have to give them a hook to hang that new information on. We need them to build mental models, physical models. That's why we use a lot of Venn diagrams. We use a lot of graphic organizers to kind of show the association between this part fits with this part. If you've ever taught 5th grade math, you know how difficult it is to try to teach them how to classify two-dimensional shapes in regards to a parallelogram is a quadrilateral and a square is a rectangle and all of that. You have to show them a model how all of those different pieces fit together. So they have to build those models, and they have to play with those either mental model or physical model. I keep going back to math, but there's so many physical manipulatives that they do in math. And in the primary grades, they've got to get those base 10 blocks out. They have to get the snap cubes out, or they have to get the 10 frames out and just see how things work. Organizing, that's the classification. They have to know, if they don't know what a jaguar is, you can say, well, a jaguar is in the feline family because it's kind of like a tiger, or it's kind of like a lion, but it's not quite like that. If we can associate something new with, it's like something else, but it's in a slightly different category, that gives us a frame of reference. So that's probably one of the largest tools that we naturally use in teaching, even when we're not thinking about it, is we're always classifying. Quickly, reflections. Ask them to reflect on their own gaps of knowledge. Ask them, do you really know? How do you know that you know? What do you think you still need to know? And the very act of reflecting on what they've learned and what they still think they need help with, that is going to help them elaborate and kind of identify those gaps. Analyzing. And we do a lot of analysis. That's a lot of higher order thinking, but how do you break something down? What are the component parts and what are the relationships? We get a lot of information out of error analysis. So in math, we might show a problem and we might show a kid trying to subtract across zeros. And then we show them an incorrect example. And then we ask the kids, okay, where did the kid mess up? Can you identify the error? Can you analyze it and figure out, oh, they didn't do this correctly? So that's a huge part, is analysis. The easiest one is just do it. In video game terminology, we call this learning by death. If you have any kid and you give them a brand new video game, how do they learn how to play? They do not open up the instruction manual. What they do is they might go through a tutorial, but then they play it, and then they die, and then they figure out why they died, and then they figure out not to do that again, and they get better and better and better and better. That's just trying it out. We have to let the kids just try things out. It's trial and error. They just got to do it. And then finally, if we can extend it, if we can ask them to take it and then tweak it, or you do some kind of activity on magnets and you think it was a fun little activity, and then the kid comes back the next day like, look what I found, and they went home and they took all the magnets off their parents' refrigerator and they did all these kind of things, and they found all these magnetic things. That's extension. If you could take a basic idea, and when you extend it into new configurations, and when the kids are like, oh, you could do this, that's when they get really excited, and that's when they encode it. So we're going to do one quick processing activity. It's called generative writing. So think about all that I just taught you about elaboration. And once again, that elaborate term, that will be on the slide deck, and it will be on my website. You can go back and see it after this webinar is done. But I'm going to give us 2 moments, just 2 minutes. Just think about how we can maximize our brain's encoding ability. What do we need the students to do? And so the generative writing, what it is just a structure to try to help us write. If you want to just do a free response, that's perfectly fine. But generative writing is where you give a little bit of a challenge. So challenge 1, think of a word that starts with the letter S. Try to use that word in your answer. If you want to do 2 challenges, try to use that word that you created for challenge 1 as the 3rd word in a complete sentence. And this is something you can easily do with kids. You can just switch it up a little bit. Challenge 3, it would be try to use that sentence you created in challenge 2 as the 2nd sentence in a paragraph. And you'll get some kids that will spend 20 minutes trying to get all of these challenges, and the challenges don't get you anything, but if you put in a challenge, some kids are going to love it. So let me just give us 2 minutes. Just write real quick on that same piece of paper, answering these questions. What do students need to do in order for us to maximize our brain's encoding ability? And then what should the tasks look like? And answer it for your own context with what you teach. All right, so hopefully that just gave you a moment to just think about how you can apply some of this in your own classroom. We are getting close to the end, and if you have any questions, we should have a few moments to do a question and answer session at the end. But what we did is we just talked about encoding, and that was the elaborate model. And so let's see if we can use what we've learned to do another memory test. Let's see if we can increase our score this time. I'm going to give you 8 brand new statements, excuse me. We're not going to write them down. It's going to be in the same format. You're supposed to remember what the man did and what kind of man it was, but this time we're going to elaborate. Now that we know that our brain needs to do something, we're going to add just one quick mental explanation. So if I give you something like, the twitchy man went into the house, I'm going to read it at the exact same speed, and they will be different statements, so you can't use what you've done previously. Come up extend that a little bit. Try to come up with a reason to explain. Why would the twitchy man go into the house? So I would say the twitchy man went into the house, and while I'm pausing, think, why would a twitchy man go into the house? Maybe an explanation would be to get his medication. Maybe he needed to get some meds. All you need to do is add that little explanation to yourself mentally and just watch what happens when we go over the answers again. So that's how we're going to beat this memory test. I'm going to give you 8 new statements. Do not write them down. You just use your memory. But after each statement in that little break that I give you, try to come up with a reason. It could be a simple, it needs to be a reason that makes sense. If you said that the twitchy man went into the house because he went to the moon, if it doesn't make sense, it's not going to help you remember. But if you can come up with a reasonable explanation as to why, just watch what happens, and you'll see how much better you do. So we're not writing any of these down yet. We're simply going to use our memory. Here we go. 1. The chubby man raced to his brother's house. 2. The humorous man turned off his cell phone. 3. The athletic man clenched his fists. 4. The jolly man sat down on the curb. 5. The dedicated man decided to call in sick. 6. The religious man ate another donut. 7. The businessman took off his glasses. 8. The frustrated man stared at the hole. All right, so if you have your pencil and paper, I'm going to do the same thing we did last time. I'm going to ask you in a different order what each man did, and just write down, doesn't have to be perfect, what you thought each of them did. Number 1, what did the humorous man do? Number 2, what did the dedicated man do? Number 3, what did the businessman do? Number 4, what did the chubby man do? Number 5, what did the frustrated man do? Number 6, what did the athletic man do? Number 7, what did the religious man do? And then finally, number 8, what did the jolly man do? Now let's check our answers. Hopefully we got better scores, and we can share those in the chat. So, number 1, the humorous man turned off his cell phone. Hopefully he came up with a good answer or a good reason as to why he would do that. Number 2, the dedicated man decided to call in sick. Number 3, the businessman took off his glasses. Number 4, the chubby man raced to his brother's house. Number 5, the frustrated man stared at the hole. Number 6, the athletic man clenched his fists. Number 7, the religious man ate another donut. And then finally, number 8 was the jolly man sat down on the curb. Now let's take a moment. How did you do? And go ahead and share, if you would, in the chat how we did, and how did this do, how did you do compared to your previous one? We'll take a moment and we can just look at people's answers here. All right, Maureen, 1 out of 8 to 6 out of 8. Kelly got the same. Jessica got 6 out of 8. Jessica, Aurora, you are not Dory anymore. Very good. 6 out of 8. Angie, 8 out of 8. All we did was one little tiny thing. I just asked you to add one tiny little explanation. And as you did, you were trying to make sense. And rather than a weird piece of information about a chubby man or a businessman, suddenly there was some kind of context. You might have said that the chubby man raced to his brother's house because he couldn't wait to see his nieces and nephews. Or the frustrated man stared at the hole because he just missed a putt. Whatever explanation you gave, it made sense to you, and your brain remembered it. Now that's going to get it into long-term memory. If we wanted all these random pieces of information to last for next week, we would have to do some retrieval practice. This is all useless information, so we don't have to remember it for next week, but we at least got it into your long-term memory, or we at least had the potential to do that. So here's just kind of a big summary. Students learn more when they elaborate during encoding. So that's what we did with the memory test. We just added a little bit of explanation, and the elaboration is a lot more. It's the explaining, it's the looking, it's the associating, the building, all of that. And then when they retrieve with spacing, interleaving, and metacognitive feedback. Now, if you're interested, my latest book, Worksheets Don't Work, actually shows you 50 different alternatives that you can do for encoding. If you want to learn more about the retrieval and all of that, those are those other two books, the Powerful Learning and the Make It Stick. And you've already actually experienced 3 of the 50 strategies. So the word pyramid is one that you can use with students, and there's in the book I also use quite a few variations if you wanted to change it. That particular one used look, associate, build, trying, and extending. There's a lot more there. Prediction guide, we also did that. I didn't print it out ahead of you, and we didn't really go back to it, but some of us have used a prediction guide before. We know that really gives students a purpose for reading. And then finally, the generative writing is something that we can do, and here's some examples of how we can use it, and then how we can also tweak it and make it vary it up so it's not the same thing every single time. But that is, for the most part, that is really what we're wanting to look at tonight. We do have some a little bit of time left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my information up on the screen. You can reach me at, there's my Twitter handle, on my website, there's my Amazon site. If you're interested, you can get 1 CPE credit for this webinar on that website, the same one where you clicked to get the calendar invite. There's a little button that says, let me take the quiz, and it's just like 3 questions, and then I'll give you 1 free hour CPE credit. I am a certified CPE provider for the state of Texas, but we do have a few moments, and so let's see if we can open up the question and answer session. And so if you have any questions, you can click on the Ask a Question button that's on your screen. If not, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see if I'll hit as many of these questions as I can. So it showed me that I just had a question. Let me see if I can figure out where that is real quick. All right, let me see if I can get the question here. Let me see. If someone clicked on the Ask a Question, I didn't necessarily see. I didn't see that question, so you might click on that button one more time. Let me see what happens here. Okay. If you want to click on that button again, there we go. If you have a question, I think what it does is it lets me unmute you, and you can just you can ask the question verbally. All right, thank you, Della. I appreciate that. If no one has any questions, you can either put it in the chat or you can just click on that button. But thank you so much for attending, and if you have any other questions, You can reach me on my website. You can just send me an email. And thank you guys so much, and have a wonderful evening. I appreciate your attendance.